So I guess we'll get started on this talk today. I appreciate all you guys coming out. At least I'm not talking to myself again, which is always a plus. Thanks to Manchester TV for filming this and letting me use it for later opportunities. The talk today is not really going to be an academic assault on the nuances and intricacies of Charles XII. There's just no time or scope for that. But what I want to do is just kind of do an introductory discourse on the king, his life and his times, so we can just get a better understanding of the nature of the time and of what he had to go through as a 36-year-old. With that said, what would you say to Sweden as an empire? I mean, after all, as Americans, we seem to have these preconceptions, these stereotypes. So we have what? Volvo, IKEA. Everything can be built with an Allen wrench in Sweden, apparently. Swedish chef, Swedish fish, which, by the way, are actually not called Swedish fish. I spent 3 days in Stockholm, and I could not find Swedish fish. They actually call it red boat candy, and I was quite disappointed that I walked away with none. But in any case, the Sweden we know today is a welfare state, known throughout the world for its high level of health care and standards of living. It does not mirror the Sweden from 4 centuries ago, which was Sweden as an empire. Most historians put Sweden, or Sweden's rise to power, around 1611, which is the accession year of arguably their greatest warrior king, Gustav Adolf. And it was under him that they became involved in the conflict that is known as the 30 Years' War. So at that point in time, 1618 to 1648, there is a ravaging war going on, mostly on the continent in Germany, between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholics under the Holy Roman Empire had quite a lot of power and were trouncing the Protestants until Sweden became involved and became known as the saviors of Protestantism. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the conflict, and it gave Sweden Pomerania and Werder Bremen, which are the two green specks in the north of Germany. That is the start of Sweden's nation building. Unfortunately for Gustav Adolf himself, he did not live to see Sweden's victory. He was killed at his greatest triumph at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The reason I picked today for this lecture is this is his death day, and it is celebrated in Sweden as Gustav Adolf Day, where bakeries sell cakes with the king's image on it. The king's only child was a daughter, Queen Christina, who then focused more so on making Stockholm the Athens of the North. She was more interested in the arts and sciences and social pursuits. After a few years, she actually abdicated and went to Rome and converted to Catholicism. And this, of course, for a Protestant nation, raised quite a bit of a scandal. It fell to her cousin, Charles X, to take over, and he was the second of these great Carolinian warrior kings. It was under his reign that Sweden would reach the largest extent of its borders. So this map here gives us a good idea, at least of landmass, of how far Sweden extended as an empire on the Baltic. It is worth mentioning that England at this same time was becoming a world superpower as well, and the size difference is quite interesting. The pocket watch down below belongs to Charles XII, and it features 2 rows of shields that are the arms of the various provinces that Sweden held at that time. Of course, they would never hold that many again. This map gives us a bit more detail in terms of the lands conquered and gained over this time. During Charles X, we have what's called the Deluge, a series of wars in Poland, which, besides gaining more land, resulted in the internal enmity of both Russia and Poland. And that is something we need to remember for later in this talk. We then also have the Treaty of Roskilde, which was signed after Sweden defeated Denmark, its continuous enemy for years and years and years. And that resulted in Denmark seceding about a third of its territories, most importantly Scania, which is down there right on the coast of the Baltic. At the same time, we have the 2-year Russo-Swedish War. In case you're not catching this, there's been a lot of conflict at that period of time. I have no idea how historians of this period actually keep track of this stuff. That's why I stay about 200 years earlier. The Russo-Swedish War ended with the Treaty of Carolus, and we have Russia seceding Livonia, Kexholm, and Estonia, which essentially seals Russia off from the Baltic. This also is a point that we need to remember for later. Lastly, we have the Scanian War, and this war, in addition to a conflict with France, split that alliance between France and Sweden, and Sweden is now perceived as a weak empire and ripe for the pickings. Charles XI now uses this time to reform Sweden internally. And there's two reforms that we need to look at in a bit more detail. The first is what's called the Endelningsverk. This is basically a military tenure system where a Swedish soldier would be housed on a farm. He would be billeted, he'd have food, clothing, and a bed, and in return he would obviously help the farmhand, and the farmer would get subsidies from the government. This system allowed soldiers to be put throughout the Swedish Empire, and they could muster with their regiments on a moment's notice. The second piece we need to look at is the reduction. This is basically the repossession of crown lands from the hands of the nobility who became too powerful. And by doing so, Charles XI cut the national debt by 3/4. If only we could do that today. Seems like a good idea. One last piece, and then we'll start moving on to what you guys actually came for, Charles himself, is population. That's always something people ask me about, regardless of what I'm lecturing about. In this case, Sweden had a population of about 1.5 million people. 3 million if you include all the other territories, Finland, Livonia, and the German provinces. Stockholm itself had the largest concentration, the capital, with about 60,000 Swedes. Now, to put that into perspective, the three nations that went up against Sweden in the Great Northern War numbered 30 million. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the upcoming discussion. And I guess you can kind of see where it's gonna tank. So now we get on to Charles himself. The young prince was born June 17th, 1682, to Charles XI and his Danish wife, Queen Ulrika Eleonora. And of course, being the firstborn prince, he was heavily guarded and quickly educated. He could ride horses at the age of 4. He made his first public appearance that way. He could write full letters at the age of 6. He hunted at 8, and he could kill his first bear at the age of 10. He was raised on the principles of absolute rule by his father. In addition to these reforms that Charles XI implemented, we also had the introduction of the absolute monarchy, although it wouldn't see its complete form until Charles XII. He was also taught by his mother, and this gives him a lighter edge. And he was taught to be generous, accountable, honorable, and kind to his subjects in all things. And we have a really neat story that comes from his youngest sister, Ulrika Eleonora the Younger, who talks of Charles being placed on a seat by his nursemaid and made to promise that he will not move from that spot until she returned. She then left and believes she went to say goodnight to her lover or fiancé. The queen came early to pick Charles up to take him to church and was absolutely aggravated that the little boy refused to move from that spot. It was only until the nursemaid came back that he got up and left with his mother. So it just goes to show how quickly influenced by his parents and their morals and deeds, and it was something he carried for the rest of his life. He really wanted a brother because he wanted to go travel the world and see things. He didn't really want to rule, so that the brother could stay in his stead and govern. He did actually have 4 brothers. Unfortunately, all 4 of them died in infancy, which gives us this painting here. So we have the young prince, his elder sister, his younger sister, and then the 4 princes as cherubs in the top corner. Charles really enjoyed studying. He was always interested in the sciences and the arts. When he was on exile in Turkey, he would actually send exhibitions to the Holy Land and to the Orient. He really enjoyed divinity, Latin, German, and he really loved fortifications and math. Especially with math, he said, anyone who does not like the subject is considered a half person, so I know where I stand. That's why I'm a historian. His mother then, well, actually, before I get to that, this picture on the right side comes to us from the Livrustkammern. It is the armory and treasury of the royal palace in Stockholm. Those are his two rattles and whistles, so he loved making noises. And we actually have a painting of him beating his drums. The piece underneath is actually a piece of his fetal membrane. When he was born with this on the top of his head. It's called a caul. And Swedish omen said that anyone who was born with this caul was destined for greatness. The warrior king Gustav Adolf had the same thing, reportedly. His mother died quite early, so he was already robbed of one, and he drew closer to his dad, following him around and learning the means of government. He spent a lot of his time here at Karlbergs, which became his boyhood home. You can actually still go there today. It's a military academy, so you can't go in, but if you tour the grounds, you can still see the areas where he played, and you can actually still see the burial site of one of his beloved dogs. His father then proceeded to die at the age of 42, the oldest of the warrior kings, believe it or not. And this was when Charles was only 15. And right shortly before his death, the king called the young prince in, and they had a private session. We have no idea what was said in that session, but we can assume that Charles was made to promise that he would be a good ruler. He would not enter war just for the fun of it, but if war did come, he would execute it with all force. And we believe, at least with all the research, that he held to these principles for the rest of his life. The legal age for a monarch to govern in Sweden was 15. That said, a lot of times you were given a regency until you were 17 or 18, just for levels of maturity. Charles had his grandmother take over the regency, but he was quickly growing tired of her kind of stuffing him down. And his ministers saw that and basically created a coup and got Charles out of the regency and into power at the age of 15. He was coronated that winter in 1697, and he emerged from Wrangel's palace already with the crown already on his head. This is unprecedented. That doesn't happen. You are crowned by the church. So when he got to the church, he refused to take the crown off. It was not put back onto his head, nor did he accept an oath of fealty. To him, his power as an absolute ruler, the first absolute ruler of Sweden, came directly from God, not from man. When I was in Stockholm, I got to take a private tour of the Palace of Three Crowns, at least what remains of it. The palace burnt down actually while Charles XI was laying in state in the building. Charles XII actually led the rescue efforts. The palace, we have a good idea of what it kind of looked like based on this model. It's similar, if you're interested in Tudor history, to Hampton Court, where the old palace of Henry VIII, the run-down, windswept Tudor court, was replaced by Christopher Wren with a new Baroque Palladian style. In this case, we have the same thing. The architect Nicomedes Tessin started building a brand new, modern palace. And that initial wing was there and survived the fire. Now the palace is a completely different piece, but it's based off of that initial design. And of course, with the fire, they had to quickly make do with something else. They converted Wrangel's house into a palace for the time being. Charles really enjoyed domestic affairs. And it is said that had war not come, he would have made a great king. Unfortunately for us, we don't have much to judge. He only reigned as a king for 3 years at the age of 15 to 18 before he went off to war. And of course, he never returned from that. Within that period, we have some interesting stories where he kind of rebelled against the establishment, if you will. For being someone who's really held back, he kind of let loose, at least for a little bit. His brother-in-law, Friedrich, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, which we must remember for later, it is a province just south of Denmark and a vital ally to Sweden. He visited Stockholm in April of 1698. And he was, of course, young, powerful, rich, and he brought with him his merry band of young courtiers. Well, Charles got caught up in this, and we have what's called the Mad Period, the Gottorp Fury, where these men, Frederick and Charles, would go about causing pranks and all manner of mischief around Stockholm. I think it's a bit exaggerated for the time, but they did do things. They smashed windows with rocks. They did early versions of Ding Dong Ditch, if you will. They got drunk very often, a lot of revelry. At one point, they had a bear in the palace, got it drunk on wine, it broke through a window and fell 3 floors. And of course, this was all shock and scandal. He actually came back from a hunt once, completely thirsty, and he used wine to slake his thirst. Of course, got very rambling and drunk. With his slurred speech, his grandmother just completely upbraided him, smacked him upside the head, and dressed him down. And from that point on, he swore off all alcohol. He would never drink again, unless absolutely necessary in the field. And that is something he held to for the rest of his life. It's another one of his characteristics. If he promised something, that promise was fulfilled. The last thing worth mentioning about his personality and his early life is marriage. He never did marry, so naturally there's accusations of homosexuality. Just people don't understand why he would not marry immediately. In this case, Charles was a romantic. He was kind of shy and blushed about talk of marriage. He would actually leave conversations if the topic came up. And eventually he said he wanted to marry for love. And he said, it's better to wait a few years. Better to wait a few years. Of course, then when the war came, he said he would marry when peace arrived, which it never did. So I don't think these accusations hold any water. Now then, we can get on to his looks and appearance. So he was about 5'9". He was very fit, trim, athletic, good posture, which he was actually noted for. This type of stuff is written in the letters. The only time he actually put on weight was in Turkey, which he called the lazy dog days, when he had nothing better to do with his time. What you're going to see in the next 2 slides, this and the next one, is that the portraits all look kind of the same. One student who saw him in 1707 said no portrait of him is ever painted like the king. And it's really not easy to paint him because he had no outstanding features. If we look at political characters today, there's big ears, a big nose, stuff like that, but there's nothing really that draws him out. And there was a debate on whether he had an angular facial structure or a rounded facial structure. And that's still going on today. In fact, the king of Sweden in 1799 was so curious, he had the coffin opened to see. And they eventually decided that it was the one on the left. That has since been refuted. He always demanded to be painted realistically. When he was a child, he survived a bout of smallpox and actually really enjoyed showing off the scars on his face. He thought that was very manly. And in this case here, he wanted to be painted kind of like Oliver Cromwell, warts and all. He shocked the court and Europe with the paintings that were coming back from the field. He stopped wearing a wig in 1701. It just wasn't practical for military purposes. But for a society that is bound by social status and order and the wearing of wigs, this was quite a change. By 1706, that earlier portrait we saw, his skin is completely weather-beaten and tanned, quite the opposite of what you expect from a king. The portrait in 1712 is his time in Bender, Turkey, during his exile. And he was actually very, very happy with this portrait. So I think it's a good representation of him if we had to pick one. The one on the right is quite the opposite. When he first saw this portrait and the artist left him with it, he slashed it with his sword. And for a person so noted for his orderliness and self-control, this outburst really says something to us. Now, did he perhaps, this is 1717, a year before he died, does this maybe reflect upon how tired he saw himself, how war-weary? Perhaps he lost a sense of humanity in the painting. We don't know. It was repainted, and that's the one we have today, which he turned out to enjoy. And then lastly, we have the perception of Henry. That's my real subject matter. Charles. The perception of Charles changes depending on the time period and the context of whatever's going on at that point. For example, around 1700, England gets a new king, George I, who happens to be a German prince from Hanover. Of course, Germany's trying to get, Hanover's trying to get Swedish territories, so naturally it makes sense to portray the king in a negative light. So we have these propaganda pamphlets start going around. And they actually went out. There was a counter movement. Yeah, Charles is great, but the negative image won out in England. They tried to show him as war-hungry, a zealot, a tyrant. Voltaire, of all people, saves Charles. He actually wrote arguably his best work and the most well-known biography of the king in 1731. And he sees Charles as this brilliant, brilliant king. We then also get Samuel Johnson, a poet, and he berates the king as well and satirizes him in one of his poems. But before we get to that one, these are a couple of the quotes that are associated with the king that people use to show he's war-hungry and angry all the time. The sword does not jest. Well, it definitely doesn't. That was mentioned when Denmark was dragging their feet on certain diplomatic proposals. So if words only get you so far, but if you rattle your saber, it'll definitely change. So that's what that means. He's probably best known for the next quote: "I have resolved never to start an unjust war, but never to end a legitimate one except by defeating my enemies." And this probably harkens back to that deathbed talk that he had with his father. I don't want to start a war, but if it does come, I'm going to wage it until it's won. Charles does have a light side as well, as evidenced by the last quote: "If all those who criticized me suffer the death penalty, there would be none left alive in Sweden." So he knew that he had to deal with his people properly. So that's kind of his mother coming through. As mentioned, we have Samuel Johnson, who wrote The Vanity of Human Wishes in 1749. He was an anti-war poet. And I guess all poets are anti-war. And in this case, he berates Charles in many, many stanzas. "Peace courts his hand, but spread her charms in vain. Think nothing gained," he cried, "till naught remain. All is mine beneath the polar sky." He's war-hungry, he wants power, he wants land. And then the grand name that Charles built for himself, at least the way Johnson portrays it, becomes just a moral. "His fall was destined to a barren strand, a petty fortress and a dubious hand. He left the name at which the world grew pale to point a moral or adorn a tale." So basically all that effort got him nothing. That's what the poem is actually trying to educate. In terms of Swedish perceptions, during my time in Stockholm, I tried to interview as many Swedes as I could to kind of get a feel of what they thought of the king. It turns out that in the 1800s, we have the rise of Romanticism, national pride, and he was brought back into the spotlight because he gave Sweden national pride. He was successful early on in his military career. At the same time, in 1868, he got his first and only statue in the Stockholm King's Garden. But it does change over time. After World War II, we have the emergence of the Swedish welfare state, and then he's portrayed as this wasteful spender of both money and lives. When it comes to today, people are kind of divided. He's not the most well-regarded king, but he's not the worst either. And the debate continues over whether his death was by the enemy or an internal job. And it's still driving the imagination today, so much so that they are petitioning to open the coffin for the 5th time to do some more scientific research. Now then, I hope that gives us a bit of an idea. I know it was quick, but it gives us a bit of idea of where Sweden was, where Charles was when the Great Northern War hit. So the Great Northern War is probably the penultimate conflict between the Scandinavian and Eastern countries dealing with the Baltic. If we remember, Denmark, Norway, that joint nation, wanted to regain the territories it lost in the Second Northern War, Scania, for example. Poland, Saxony wanted to have Livonia back, the region of Lithuania on the Baltic. And Russia, they just wanted a port on the Baltic. They lost everything, and Peter the Great comes along and says, I want to build the greatest port city in the world. And that, of course, becomes St. Petersburg. Charles found out about the conflict, and he seemed to be quite surprised by it. He couldn't understand why these nations really wanted to have a piece of them. If we take this quote and we translate it into modern English, I think it would sound something like, "Aw, hell no," because it is strange that both my cousins want war. So be it. We have a just cause, and God will help us. It's very concise, very firm.
Who are his cousins?
His cousins, Augustus, the leader of Poland, and the Danish king was also cousins. I mean, all the families intermarried. So good question. So with that said, those three nations, basically, they saw an 18-year-old king, inexperienced probably, little did they know, and decided now was the right time to attack Sweden, get everything back, and then some. Denmark started the war by attacking Sweden's ally, Holstein-Gottorp, and destroying the castle of Tonning. Charles responds. On August 4th, 1700, he lands on the coast of Zealand, which is off of Denmark, with about 2,500 troops in the first wave, going up against 5,000 of the enemy. And he's so excited to get into this mess that he actually jumps overboard and swims to shore. And then we have the rest of his troops following him. So you can imagine this line of troops holding, into their shoulders in water, holding their muskets above their head, trying to keep the powder dry, following the king who made it to the beach first into enemy fire. The beachhead assault was actually quite a success. In total, 3 Swedes died. It seems that the mercenaries and garrison stationed on the island were not well trained, didn't really care, so they gave up quite quickly. Charles then marches on to Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, and tries to besiege the city and end the war quickly. He gets a note from one of his adjutants saying that Denmark sued for peace a few days ago with Holstein-Gottorp separately. So he's just standing there now holding his arms out. Really, guys, we have this entire army. What do we do with it? Denmark is effectively out of the war within weeks of starting it. Very good success for Sweden. He finds out that the city of Narva is being besieged by the Russians, and Narva is now around modern-day Estonia. It's a coastal town on the Baltic. So he gets everyone back in the boats and sails up the Baltic and gets out by Narva. So November 19th, barely 2-3 months after his initial attack, we have the Battle of Narva, and this is arguably Charles' greatest victory. He is once again completely outnumbered. The Russians are in a secure, fortified position. And he actually leads his troops out of the wood line and offers open battle to the Russians. Of course, the Russians just laugh. Why would we come out of our defensive fortifications and attack you? We're just going to sit right here, thank you very much. So he decides to form his columns and attack the Russians head on. Nicely enough for him, a snowstorm rises up and blows directly into the face of the Russian defenders. The fire from the Russians was so intense that Charles lost both his bodyguards. One of them suffered 13 wounds. When Charles finished the battle and took the scarf off from around his neck, a bullet fell out. It was the first of 5 bullets to actually hit him in his life. What it did do is give him the sense of invulnerability. And there was this myth that grew up around him that a modern bullet could not kill him. In any event, with the Battle of Narva, the Russians fled. They suffered horrendous losses. So 667 Swedes died, In comparison, 9,000 Russians perished, 20,000 captured, the entire Russian army. Of course, Charles didn't have the means or provisions to keep the soldiers. He had them turn in their guns and sent them back to Moscow. This, essentially for now, kicks Russia out of the war. Yes? In regards to the Russians drinking vodka, there's a bunch of different theories going around. So some say that the Russians found these stores of vodka and got a little tipsy on it, and that led to it. Others say the Russians weren't well trained. Others say that Peter left them and the morale just absolutely dropped. And others say the allies that they had, even the Swedes got drunk. Their Finnish contingents also found vodka stores, and so it naturally became a drunken mess by the end of it. But that's not the glory that Charles wants. So Russia's kicked out of the war, and Peter is left to sulk in Moscow. He has to have the church bells melted down because he lost all his cannons. And Russia's now effectively out for the while. Historians and critics now say Charles should have pursued Russia. After all, Russia's completely weak. Why did he not immediately go into Russia? If you look at it in the details and the context, Poland was the larger and more important enemy at the time. They were still very strong, well-trained with their Saxon forces. So Charles diverted and moved into Poland. He had several successes there. We had the Battle of Klisau in 1702, and this was a massive Polish-Saxon defeat. Charles decides to winter in Poland, and he goes and visits the battlefield of Lutzen, which was Gustav Adolf's greatest finest hour. It was said that Charles could actually recite every regiment's name and their location in the battle from memory. And Gustav was a grand hero to Charles, and he wished that he could suffer the same end as Gustav did. Little did he know. We have one last battle to mention. It's the Battle of Fraustadt in 1706. And this is known for its successful pincer maneuver, complete entrapment of Russian and Polish Saxon forces. So it's harkened back to the ancient Battle of Cannae. With Poland now kicked out with the Treaty of Altenstadt, Charles, within 6 years, has effectively knocked out two of the most powerful nations. Now he's left with Russia, and that's it. We're ready to go. So he marches into Russia, and he gets hit by the Russian winter and the scorched earth policy. It is worth mentioning that Napoleon was a big follower of Charles XII. He studied everything about him. What does he do? He invades Russia in the snow and suffers grave consequences. Adolf Hitler studied Napoleon. What does he do? Invade Russia, gets hit by the winter storm and the scorched earth policy, and there you go. So history really does repeat itself if you're not prepared. Charles gets to Russia, and we have what's known as the grandest battle, the Battle of Poltava. This has gone down in Russian lore as the start of the Russian Empire, and it gave Peter I the title Peter the Great. Charles was completely weakened. His force was completely weakened. He actually suffered a bullet wound in his foot, which disabled him and prevented him from leading his troops from the front. This meant he had to assign generals to lead the attack. They, of course, did not get along well, and the orders soon became jumbled. The Swedes were attacking a well-fortified Russian army again. They were outnumbered again, except this time the Russians were well-trained. It was said that the Russians learned their battle tactics at Narva. And it really showed, because the entire Swedish army was basically wiped out. 7,000 dead that day, the rest of the army captured days later. And that was the end of Charles' grand Swedish army. The army, however, must get credit for its successes. They were known for the cold steel tactic. They were kind of the purveyors of the bayonet. They would march up in their ranks. They would maybe fire off one volley, if that, mount bayonets, and charge. They preferred close quarter combat. They also employed light field artillery, which was their absolute favorite. They could move guns into position and out of position before enemy gunners could train on them. These are some of the relics of the Great Northern War. We have a regimental banner, a drum, important for belting out orders musically, and an ammunition bag, all with the royal monogram. Poltava is remembered in the Swedish psyche as well. We have the Poltava monument outside of the Army Museum in Stockholm, where Mother Svea, basically the Swedish equivalent to Lady Liberty or Lady Britannia, draping the flag over a fallen soldier. And then Charles, his only statue, has him in his favorite outfit, pointing towards Poltava, his one and only loss. He was never defeated in battle when he led personally. So he had to retreat to Turkey in Bender, and he worked with the Sultan to get back at Peter. He was itching for a fight. They actually surrounded Peter, had him outnumbered, but Peter bought his way out. That made Charles furious. Eventually, the Sultan got tired of the king scheming and tried to kick him out of Bender. That skirmish became known as the Kalabalik, and that term is still used today by the Swedes when referring to causing a ruckus. Eventually, Charles does decide to return home, and he has to hide his identity. So he takes on the identity of Captain Peter Frisk, and this is the wig he wore when he made his renowned 15-day horseback ride, 15 days consecutively on horseback. He never stopped, and he made it from Turkey all the way to Swedish territory in northern Germany. There was a medal struck in honor of that, and the phrase, "Was sorgt ihr doch? Gott und ich leben noch." What worries you so? God and I yet live. And of course, as soon as he gets back to Sweden in 1714, he wants another army to have another go. Yeah? Question? Nope? Okay. So now we get to the last stage of his life and military campaigning. He launches an attack on Norway, which of course belongs to Denmark. With the defeat of Sweden at the hands of the Russians, both Denmark and Poland they tore up their treaties and got right back into it. They declared war again. So there was something to be said about honor in the time. There wasn't any. So he attacks Norway in an effort to drive Denmark out of the war for the second time. He gets all the way to Christiania, which is now known as Oslo. And he's successful in taking the entire city except for the fortress of Akershus, which he never did. He then retreats, and he besieges Friedrich's fortress. However, he has to call it off because his supply ships were destroyed en route. While a lot of people give him grief for the 1716 exhibition, it was successful because it dissuaded Russia from invading Sweden. They never did. They never attempted because of continuous Swedish success. How different the maps would be today if that occurred. In 1718, Charles decides to have one more go at it. He once again invades Norway, and he lays siege to Friedrich's fortress. Now, I got to visit this in May, and it looks foreboding on the picture, but it's far worse when you're there. Just the sheer scale and height of these cliff faces. The backside is a bit more tame, but it's very daunting. We get to November 27th. The king, once again, at the age of 36, is leading the charge. He's one of the first Swedes to jump over the outside fortifications and take them. They then start building a trench line outside the fortress, trying to inch closer so they can sap the fortress walls, take it down, and jump in. The fortress now a bit overgrown, but it still gives us a good idea of kind of the structure and the layout. And then that's a reproduction of a Swedish trench. They have these baskets up at head level, so you can obviously hide behind them during enemy fire. We then get to November 30th, the night of November 30th. The king entered the old Swedish line because he wanted to see his troops digging the new line. Morale was desperately low because they were getting picked off by enemy fire. They were now that close. That musket fire was reaching them. So he wanted to bolster morale by showing his presence. That was something he always did in both war and at peace. He also wanted to observe the fortification and enemy fire coming from it. So if I can probably illustrate this. He jumps up on top of the trench. He digs his feet into the trench wall, and this is the trench parapet. And so he'll put his arm down like this, and he rested his head onto his hand. And so the fortress is straight this way, and we have the trench right in front of us like this. So he's constantly looking this way. And his officers were trying to pull him down. He was exposing himself to enemy fire. And then sure enough, just after 9 a.m. or 9 p.m., a shot strikes, and the king is dead instantly. One eyewitness said it sounded similar to a stone being thrown into wet mud. Another said it's the sound of 2 fingers striking the palm very sharply. And that was it. They pull the king down, who remained suspended. The shot was so quick that his body remained frozen in that position. They pulled him down and retreated. What this is here, on the right side, we have a picture that I took from the furthest point of the fortress, that little grass in the foreground, to his memorial stone in the back where he's supposedly to have been shot. And then the opposite angle. So that's kind of the distance. We're looking at about 250 to 300 meters. There's since been 6 different memorials dedicated to Charles on that site. They've all been in different positions. So the real spot of his death is kind of unknown at the moment. They took his body back to Sweden in what became known as the Carolean Death March. A blizzard hit the troops moving back to Sweden. They were low on provisions, and quite a substantial number never made it out of the mountains. And he's buried in Riddarholmen Church, which is kind of the Westminster Abbey of Sweden. We have a lot of the monarchy here. He's buried across from his idol Gustav Adolf and just above the rest of the Carolean kings. He's in that gray Rococo-style building on the left. Now then, the last point, and this is the good stuff. Was he killed by an honest enemy bullet, or was this something far more sinister? This map gives us a good idea of his position and the position of various sources of fire at the time. So we have the old line trench, Charles in between the two in a connecting trench, and then the new line, which is where they were digging. To the bottom left, we have Malmberg and Overberg. These were 2 bastions where enemy guns were mounted. And if you're looking in the meters, Overberg is about 650, Malmberg is about 400, and then we're looking at maybe 200 from the new line. There's a quick overview. So we have the 2 points from the top there, and then the bottom jutting out there. And Charles, the line was at that tree line on the far right. And you can see that those lines there indicating a lake or a marsh, that is the remnants of that. So, this is the uniform that he wore when he was killed. Let's start by looking at the argument for assassination. Almost immediately afterwards, there were already accounts and ideas being circulated that he was assassinated. His surgeon, a German named Neumann, had a dream where the king woke up on the embalming table, came to life, and called Neumann to his side. And Neumann said, Your Majesty, what happened? And he said, in all good time, I will point it out to you, but just know that one came creeping. The motive for assassination probably best fits his friend and commander, Friedrich of Hesse. He married Charles' youngest sister and was thus in line for the Swedish throne. Not the first, but he was connected. So it's thought that maybe it was Friedrich who had this assassination plotted. After all, he seemed very agitated that night and only calmed down once he heard that Charles was killed. It is said that his adjutant, a French adjutant, had him shot. And sure enough, in 1722, this adjutant, while sick and delirious with fever, claimed that he shot the king. Of course, as soon as he came to, he was horrified by that and recanted. If we look at it through modern history, Secre, that's his name, was in the trench at the time with Charles, so in all likelihood, it was not him. Voltaire agrees. Several other people have had the same confession. The biggest proponent for assassination is a Finnish historian, and he believes that bullets and ballistics testing will help us identify that It was a Swedish attempt. He believes that you need about 150 to 225 meters per second velocity to pierce the hat. You can see the bullet hole in the hat, pierce through 2 layers of felt and the skull cleanly without shattering the skull. So that, of course, rules out long ranges from those 2 fortification bastions in the south and arguably from the fortress itself. He then says that a lead bullet, which was common at the time, would leave splinters in the bone that you could not remove. When they did x-rays in 1917, they checked out his foot, which was hit by a lead bullet, and there were lead splinters everywhere. However, there were none in the skull. So this led him to think that perhaps the bullet is jacketed, meaning lead wrapped in brass or some other type of metal that would leave no residue. If we assume that, and we take his measurement of 19.5 millimeters for the hole in the hat, you can deduce that the Danes did not have that type of ammunition. They didn't have that size caliber. So it couldn't have been them. It couldn't have been the bastions, and it couldn't have come from the fortress. So who had that technology? Who had that type of a jacketed bullet? The Swedes did. So it suggested that someone got into a trench on the side. He was shot left to right, and during a burst of gunfire, fired the shot. And that it was made to look like a long-distance shot simply by using less gunpowder. That is countered by another historian who says the hole in the hat is 18 millimeters. So now we have a problem we can't measure correctly. But a friend of mine who works for the Royal Palace in Stockholm, Daniel, he suggested that they're measuring the 2 holes within the hat itself. So while the Finnish historian, Carl Nortling, measured 19.5 on the outer hole, the other gentleman measured the inner hole, which is probably less touched, less manipulated, and that's 18 millimeters. Well, in that case, that opens up all the ammunition that was used that day. He also suggests that testing conducted on the firing range with lead bullets through felt, through the skull, could be done with a lead bullet with the exact same results that we saw here. And ultimately, his suggestion is that the shot came from the fortress itself when the king happened to have turned his head. Now, whether we ultimately will know, it's anyone's guess. I don't think, barring new information, that's ever going to come out. And it's not really talked about much anymore. In fact, that signpost there next to his uniform says it's a moot point. But that is his uniform, completely preserved. It was quite amazing to see. I put this slide in because it's going to help me out and warn you guys for the next slide. So this is his sarcophagus within the church, and that image comes from the 1917 reopening. So the next slide will have images of the dead king. So if you are squeamish, you might not want to look at the next slide. Ready? All right. So apparently his surgeon did a good job. So this is Charles in the 1917 autopsy. He was hit from the left, and the hole is actually bigger than it is from the right. So maybe the felt distorted the bullet. We don't know. But they keep checking. But again, I don't know if we'll ever find out. There are more online. You can actually read the autopsy report if you're interested and have some sort of morbid curiosity, as I do. I think it's best to end with this poignant anagram. With Charles's death, Friedrich I usurps the crown in a roundabout way. He becomes Friedrich I of Sweden. And the Great Northern War continues for 3 more years. But by that point, Sweden has lost the will. They surrender. We have the Treaty of Neustadt in 1721. And the Swedish Empire basically dissolves. We have Sweden still. They still keep Finland. But the majority of their possessions are all taken away. And Sweden remains a regional power, but never the dominant power that it once was. So the glory of the age is past and gone. We to our former nothingness are fated. King Charles is dead. King Frederick consecrated. And Sweden's clock has moved from 12 to 1. And with that, the time of the Swedish Empire is over. Thank you. I know we have about 10 minutes yet. Can I answer any questions that you may have? I know that was a lot of information. Yes.
Hi, well, first, thanks for a very interesting talk. Great to spend the lunch. But I was wondering, you're saying Charles XII brought the kind of full fruition of absolutism to Sweden.
Yes.
I was wondering if he kind of trailblazing in this regard, or is he kind of copying other European monarchs, or if these kind of new ideas coming from Sweden?
To be honest, we really don't know, just because he only had those 3 years, and he was 15 to 18. So he wasn't really able to flex his power. However, he did really use that absolute power to ask for more troops and more money, and it was always given. In terms of his coronation, that was something that no one has seen before, at least in Sweden, that he wore the crown already himself and swore no oath. So that's a good point. I'm sure historians of that period might have a better answer for you. Other questions? Yes?
I think you said Voltaire described him as brilliant.
Yep.
What was his grounds for that?
Voltaire was quite taken by the king. I believe he met him once. I'm not sure on that, but I remember reading something about that. And he just saw the king as this brilliant warrior king, that he loved the mathematics, he loved sciences, and he treated his people well. It's only towards the end, when Sweden is so heavily taxed, both in manpower and money, that resentment starts to turn against the king. But even then, he was very much mourned with his death. He was always well regarded, so I think that kind of just rubbed off on whoever saw him, including diplomats. Yes?
So where does the speculation come that he was killed by his own people if he was so well regarded and loved?
Good question. To be honest, we don't know. With Friedrich of Hesse, there's the motive that he wants to take the crown.
Was there bad blood between them?
No, they were very close, actually. But people will do anything for power. So it could be. There's also the idea that towards the end of his career and life, Charles had a new minister in Sweden, Baron Götz, and he was very good at being a minister, getting the money, getting support. But of course, the people hated him. It's far easier to hate a minister than to hate your king. So this king, or this minister, drummed up a lot of resentment from the Swedish people, and they all wanted him removed. He irked the nobility as well. So it's thought that, and the king refused to remove him. He really enjoyed the minister. He thought he did a really good job. So it's thought that maybe the king was removed, then they could remove the minister. And sure enough, within 2 days of the king's death, the minister was arrested, given a sham trial, and executed. So that could be another motive for an internal kill. I started the whole process thinking he was assassinated, but I think now it might just be a really lucky enemy shot, just happening in the fog of war. Anything else? Good? Excellent. Well, I appreciate you all for coming. It's great to not have to talk to myself. It is, believe me. And yeah, continue to check the website on UNH for the brown bag lectures. There's always good stuff going on. And if you are interested in taking classes here at UNH, I will be teaching next semester a course on Henry VIII and the transition of England from a medieval power to an early modern state. And this will be Humanities 592. So talk to your counselor, get involved, and it'll be a lot of fun. Thank you very much.